Today we'll be discussing learning. Although there are multiple kinds of learning, today we'll be focusing on classical conditioning. However, we can't start talking about classical conditioning without focusing on the history of this study. Ian Pavlov was born in 1849 in Russia. He died in 1936. Most of his studies were conducted in Russia involving dogs. As a dog owner, he had readily available resources to conduct these experiments. He studied dogs in relation to psychology. There are three steps to classical conditioning. Today we'll be talking about them in association with the study of his dogs. There's the time before the conditioning occurs without any stimulus, during the conditioning with the stimulus, and after conditioning also with the stimulus. There are four parts to the time before conditioning. To begin, we present the dog with the food. This is considered the unconditioned stimulus. Next, we have salivation. This is the unconditioned response. Because there is no stimulus, we can consider this the unconditioned response, however the dog still salivates. Next, we have the neutral stimulus, with the ringing of the bell. However, no salivation occurs because the dog does not associate this ringing bell with the food. That will come later. No salivation means no unconditioned response. Next, we move on to the time during conditioning where the dog is learning to associate the food with the ringing bell. The ringing bell is the conditioned stimulus. The food in this case would be the unconditioned stimulus. The dog is still salivating at the thought of the food, and the salivation is the unconditioned response. So during conditioning, we begin to pair a bell with every time the dog receives its food, in the hopes that the dog will begin to associate this ringing bell with food, which will then elicit salivation. Not just the food, the ringing bell as well. After conditioning, we have the ringing bell, which becomes the conditioned stimulus, and salivation becomes the conditioned response. We remove the food from the equation to test this. The ringing bell is the conditioned stimulus, and the salivation is the conditioned response because when the bell rings, the dog still salivates. So to recap, in the beginning we have the food, the salivation, and the ringing bell. The ringing bell does not elicit any reaction from the dog. During conditioning, the ringing bell and the food are paired in the hopes that the dog will learn to associate the food with the ringing bell, and the salivation is the unconditioned response. In this case, the ringing bell becomes the conditioned stimulus. If the experiment is successful, the ringing bell will become the conditioned stimulus and the salivation will become the conditioned response. So every time the bell rings, the dog will salivate. We can't talk about this without also talking about stimulus generalization and stimulus discrimination. Stimulus generalization occurs when a stimulus, similar to the original conditioned stimulus, can elicit the same effects. For example, if a bell was used to condition, a bell with a different tone but similar sound will elicit the same conditioned response. So if we have a high-pitched bell that's used during conditioning, we can use a low-pitched bell and the dog will react in the same way. However, if we use a bell of the same pitch, the dog will still react. So in this case, stimulus generalization means sounds that are similar elicit similar reactions. We will see that this is not always true because we will move on to stimulus discrimination. In stimulus discrimination, the person or animal learns to distinguish between different stimuli. So for example, if we trained the dog with a certain pitch tone as opposed to a bell, if we lower the tone, the dog will no longer react in the same way because it will be able to discriminate between that tone and the original tone for which it was trained. However, if we use a higher pitched tone, then it will also distinguish between that. So therefore, stimulus generalization is saying that a sound that is similar will elicit the same reaction. So a bell is used, a bell with a different tone, but a bell with a similar sound is used, it will generalize that and elicit the same reaction. On the contrary, we have the stimulus discrimination, in which the person or animal, so this can be used on people or animals, learns to distinguish the difference between stimuli. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer them. Thanks!